A shadow replies when questioned. Holmes knows that defiance hides truth. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Comment where you're listening from. I love seeing you here. Let's step into the case. In setting down the particulars of the singular affair which I have called the case of the shadow, that answered back, I am sensible, as I so often have been, of the poverty of language when it attempts to render in cold print the swift, fine processes of my friend's mind. Many a time I have watched Sherlock Holmes pass from some apparently trifling observation to a conclusion as solid as a mason's work, yet never did the contrast between the commonplace and the extraordinary stand out more sharply than upon that winter evening when a shadow, if shadow it was, seemed to give response like a living thing. It is my habit, when the press of my medical duties permits, to record Holmes's more curious investigations, not merely that his methods may be understood by those who come after, but because the memory of them is in itself a tonic against the dullness which threatens to creep over a man of regular life. I confess there are times when the very monotony of London, with its endless procession of faces, its rumble of wheels, and its grey, damp skies, weighs upon the spirit. It is then that one is most grateful for the sharp, electric presence of Holmes, for his very restlessness, for the fierce clarity with which he sees the world's hidden joints and seams. It was in January of '88, one of those raw, fog-laden weeks when the gas lamps burn at noon, and the very air seems thick enough to cut, that I returned to our rooms in Baker Street to find Holmes in an attitude of unusual composure. He was seated upon the sofa, not sprawled as was his custom when reading some sensational monograph, but upright and still, with his long fingers steepled and his eyes half closed, as if listening to a sound beyond the reach of ordinary ears. The fire snapped faintly in the grate. The familiar mingled odours of tobacco and chemical reagents hung in the room. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps had died away upon the stair, and the hush which followed seemed, by some trick of the imagination, to be part of the fog itself. "You are late, Watson," said Holmes without opening his eyes. "My dear fellow," I returned, hanging my coat and rubbing my hands before the fire, "if you had spent the last 2 hours among the poor souls of Paddington, you would not be astonished at any man's lateness. Influenza and damp lodgings are conspiring against the whole neighbourhood." Holmes's eyelids flickered. "And yet you were not in Paddington for the last 2 hours," said he. I stared at him. "Indeed? And pray where have I been?" "In the surgery of Dr. Mortimer at Edgware Road, and thereafter at the tobacconist's in Marylebone Lane. You have had, moreover, a brief altercation with a cabman who attempted to overcharge you by 6pence. There are few things more humbling than to find one's own small adventures and irritations laid bare with the ease of a conjurer producing coins from behind a child's ear." "You amaze me," I said, though I have long since ceased to be truly amazed by him. "I did stop at Mortimer's." "Oh, it is true. He wished my opinion upon a case, and I did buy tobacco, but the cabman, how in the world—" Holmes's mouth quirked in that faint, derisive smile which served him in place of laughter. "My dear Watson, your left cuff is stained with carbolic, Mortimer's favourite disinfectant, which he uses with an indiscriminate zeal. Your boots bear the fine, pale grit of Edgware Road. You are careful, but that grit betrays itself upon the inner edge, where the brush does not reach. The tobacco is self-evident. You reek of it, and the paper in your pocket protrudes. As to the cabman, you have a fresh tear in your glove near the thumb, made by a nail upon the inside of the cab door, no doubt, and your jaw is set at that angle which in you denotes affront. You are an honest man, Watson, and cannot be cheated without making it a point of honour "Well," said I, with as much dignity as I could muster, "if I cannot conceal my adventures from you, Holmes, I can at least conceal my thoughts." "No," said he quietly, opening his eyes at last and fixing me with that peculiar, steady gaze of his, "you cannot." It was not the words alone, but the manner in which they were spoken, that made me pause with my hand upon the kettle. There was something in his tone, an undercurrent almost of preoccupation, which did not belong to our usual banter. "You have something on your mind," I observed. He shrugged, but there was no true indifference in the movement. "A trifle," said he. "A shadow, perhaps. Or perhaps only the habit of expecting shadows in London." He rose and crossed to the window, drawing aside the curtain a fraction. Outside, but the fog lay in a thick, yellow sheet through which the lamps showed as blurred coins of light. A hansom crawled past like a beetle. Somewhere down the street a costermonger called his wares in a muffled, ghostly voice. "You have been out, then?" I asked. Holmes's profile, half lit by the fire, was sharp as a cameo. "I have not been out," said he, "and yet something has happened." He let the curtain fall and turned back to me. For an instant I had the impression of a man who stands at the edge of a cliff in the mist, calm, poised, but aware that the ground is not as sure as it seems. "Watson," said he, "have you ever considered how much of what we call reality is merely the agreement of our senses? A sound in the dark, the fall of a shadow, the turn of a phrase, how easily a man may be led by them, and how rarely he questions the hand that leads." "I have considered," said I cautiously, "that you are very fond of leading men by them yourself." "Quite," said he, "and that is why I recognize the tread of another leader when I hear it." He took from the mantelpiece a small, battered metal snuff-box, the one, as I knew, which contained his shag tobacco, and shook it lightly. A faint rattle answered. He opened it and turned it upside down upon his palm. Instead of tobacco, a single object fell into his hand, a pellet no larger than a pea, wrapped in thin black wax. I leaned closer. "What is that?" Holmes held it between finger and thumb. "A message," said he. "In wax." "In wax," he repeated, and his eyes glittered with the pleasure he always took in a curious device. It was pushed beneath our door at 2 o'clock this afternoon." "You were in, then?" "I was in," he said, "and I was in the chair by the fire, and I was aware, without moving, that someone stood in the passage outside and listened." "That is not so remarkable," I returned, though I confess I felt a small chill. Baker Street has its share of idlers. Holmes's smile vanished. "The remarkable thing," said he, "is that when I shifted my weight in the chair, the person shifted also." I stared at him. "I heard the faint creak of a boot heel," he went on, as if reciting a chemical formula. "It answered my movement precisely. When I rose and stepped softly to the door, the other stepped back. 1 pace, no more, as though preserving a measured distance. When I paused, it paused. When I placed my eye to the keyhole, I saw nothing but the dimness of the passage. Yet the sense was unmistakable. I was being imitated." "You are sure it was not an echo of your own movements?" I asked, though even as I said it, I knew how feeble it sounded. Holmes shook his head. "I have lived with echoes," said he. "This was not one of them." He moved to the table, and with that fastidiousness which characterized him in all matters of observation, took up a magnifying lens. He examined the black pellet in silence for a full minute, turning it so that the lamplight caught its surface. At last he set it down and pushed it toward me. "Smell it," said he. I did so, somewhat reluctantly. There was a faint, bitter odour. "Camphor?" I suggested. "Camphor," said Holmes, and something else, a trifle of attar of roses, cheap, and a trace of phosphorus. Phosphorus, I exclaimed. But why? To make it visible, said Holmes. He took a small scalpel from his case and with a delicate motion cut the wax pellet in two. Within was a tightly folded strip of paper no more than an inch long. Holmes unfolded it with tweezers and held it up. There were 3 words upon it, written in a cramped hand, "Ask me back." I confess, I felt, for the second time that evening, that tightening about the heart which comes of being confronted with something that does not belong to the ordinary order of things. "Ask me back?" I repeated. "What does it mean?" Holmes's eyes were fixed upon the paper, but his mind was far beyond it. "It is phrased," said he, "like an invitation." "To what?" "To a conversation," said Holmes quietly. "And that, Watson, is what disturbs me." He rose abruptly and began to pace the room, his long strides carrying him from hearth to bookcase and back again. When Holmes paced thus, I knew his mind was at its fiercest work. He spoke, not to me so much as to the room itself, in those swift, half-formed sentences which were the outward sign of his inward calculations. "Not a threat," he muttered. "Not yet. Not a demand, a provocation. Ask me back." As though silence were expected, as though the sender had spoken first and awaited reply. But how had he spoken? With feet? With shadow? With that mimicry in the passage? Or— He stopped so suddenly that I nearly started. "No, Watson," said he, "did you notice anything unusual upon the landing when you came in?" "I noticed the fog," said I, "and that Mrs. Hudson had left the hall lamp burning. Nothing more." Holmes's face was thoughtful. He crossed to the door and opened it, motioning me to follow. We stepped out into the dim passage. The gas jets sputtered and hissed, casting wavering shadows along the wall. Holmes pointed to the strip of carpet runner which lay upon the boards. It was old and threadbare, marked by the passage of innumerable feet. Yet there, at the very edge of it, was a faint indentation, as though a heavy heel had pressed down and turned. "Look," said Holmes. I bent. "A footprint," I said. "A footprint," he agreed. "And beside it—" "What?" I peered closer. At first I saw nothing. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I perceived that the dust upon the board beyond the carpet's edge had been disturbed in a curious pattern, a long faint sweep, like the trail of a cloak or the dragging of something soft. "It looks as if someone brushed the boards," I said. "Or as if something brushed them," murmured Holmes. He knelt, and with a pocket-knife scraped a small quantity of the disturbed dust into a folded paper. "You are collecting it?" I asked. "Yes," said he, "because it contains what the other contains." "The other?" "The thing that stood here at 2:00, he replied, his voice low. "And it left behind it a signature." I could not restrain myself. "Holmes," I said, "this begins to sound like—" "Like superstition." He rose and dusted his hands. "No, it begins to sound like a man who wishes to be taken for a superstition." He returned to our sitting-room and shut the door with a decisive click, as if shutting out not merely the passage, but the very idea of it. Then, with the wax pellet and its tiny message before him, he seated himself once more and became suddenly still. "There are only 3 possibilities," said he, holding up a finger. "1. Some idle practical joker, aware of my habits, attempts to unsettle me. 2. Someone with a definite object wishes to draw my attention without revealing themselves. 3. He paused, and his expression grew hard. 3. Someone wishes to test whether I can be made to respond." "To respond?" I repeated. "To answer back," said Holmes. At that moment, as if the very words had summoned it, there came from below a faint sound upon the stair. It was not the heavy tread of Mrs. Hudson, nor the brisk step of some client. It was so light that one could have taken it for the settling of the old house. Yet it had rhythm. Tap, tap. Holmes's eyes flicked to mine. Tap, tap. I confess, I gripped the arm of my chair. Tap, tap. It was as though someone below, invisible in the fog of the stairwell, matched the beat of a distant clock. Holmes rose without haste, took up his poker from beside the hearth, not as a weapon, but as one might take up a cane, and moved to the door. He opened it suddenly. The passage lay empty. The stairwell beyond was a well of dimness. Yet from that dimness came as plain as speech another sound, no longer a tap, but the soft scrape of leather upon wood, a step that halted when Holmes halted, and advanced when he advanced. The hairs prickled at the back of my neck. Holmes leaned his head slightly to one side, like a hound catching scent. Then, very softly, very deliberately, he stamped his foot once upon the floor. From below, as prompt as an answer, there came a stamp in return. Holmes's lips tightened. For an instant his face was not the cool mask I knew, but the face of a man who has found his enemy's hand upon the chessboard. And he closed the door and turned to me. "Well, Watson," said he, "our correspondent has good manners. He answers when spoken to." "And what do you make of it?" I asked, striving to steady my voice. Holmes returned to the table, took up the little strip of paper once more, and looked at it with a kind of grim amusement. "I make of it," said he, "that we have been invited to a game." "A game with whom?" Holmes's gaze went, for the briefest instant, to the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "With a man who understands the value of a shadow," he said, "and who has learned how to make it answer back." Before I could reply, there came a sharp knock at our door. 3 brisk raps, urgent and official. Holmes's mood changed at once. The chill, abstract speculation vanished, replaced by that eager or alert vitality which I had come to associate with the scent of a true case. "Come in," he called. The door opened and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard entered, shaking the damp from his coat and casting a quick, uneasy glance behind him into the passage, as though the fog itself might follow. "Evening, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson?" He nodded to me, then fixed Holmes with his sharp, fox-like eyes. I've come straight from something I won't pretend to understand." Holmes gestured to the chair. "Sit down, Lestrade. You look as if London has bitten you." Lestrade sat, but only on the edge, as if ready to leap up again. "It has," said he. "Or something in it has. There's been a death in Bloomsbury, a gentleman of means, locked room, no weapon, no footprints, and the oddest bit—" He hesitated, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. "The servants swear they heard someone answer him in the dark. Not in words, mind you. In—" He swallowed, as though embarrassed to give shape to it. "In footsteps, like a man talking back with his boots." Holmes's face remained perfectly still, but I saw the small, bright spark in his eyes. "A shadow that answered back," murmured he, almost to himself. Lestrade blinked. "What's that, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes folded the tiny strip of paper with exquisite care and placed it in his pocket. "Nothing," said he pleasantly. "Only the title of the case you are about to tell me. Now, Lestrade, begin at the beginning." Lestrade cleared his throat, glanced once more at the closed door as if expecting it to contradict him, and then plunged ahead in his blunt, methodical fashion. "The name of the deceased is Mr. or Edwin Calderwick," said he. 47 years of age, a bachelor. Lived alone in a house in Bloomsbury Square, one of those tall, narrow places with a study at the back, and a view of a plane tree that's seen better days. He was found dead an hour after dusk, seated at his writing desk. No sign of a struggle, no wound that we can lay finger on, yet dead as a stone. Holmes had seated himself opposite Lestrade, his chin resting upon his long fingers. He listened with an air of polite indifference, but I knew that every word was being stored and weighed. "And the room?" asked Holmes. "Locked," said Lestrade promptly. "Door bolted on the inside, windows shut and fastened, fireplace cold. We forced the door in, of course, but there was nothing there, nothing that explains how the man died." Holmes nodded slightly. You mentioned the servants." "Aye, two of them, the housekeeper and a maid. They say that shortly before 7 they heard Mr. Calderwick moving about his study, then they heard him speak." "Speak?" said Holmes, his eyes lifting. "Yes, or rather begin to speak. They couldn't make out the words, and then—" Lestrade hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. "Then they heard someone else answer him, not with words but with footsteps. One step, then another, as if a man were pacing in reply." "In reply?" Holmes repeated softly. "The housekeeper thought it odd and went up," continued Lestrade. "She knocked. No answer. She listened, and she swears, mind you, that whatever was inside moved when she moved. When she stepped back, it stepped back. When she leaned closer, it leaned closer. She ran for help then. By the time we got the door open, Calderwick was dead." There was a short silence. The fire crackled. Outside, a cab rattled past, its wheels muffled by the fog. "And Scotland Yard's view?" asked Holmes at last. Lestrade spread his hands. "Apoplexy, or heart failure. There's no mark upon him. The doctor says there's nothing obvious, but the circumstances, well, they're queer. And when I heard about the footsteps and the locked room—" He shrugged. "I thought of you." Holmes rose at once. "Quite right," said he briskly. "You have done excellently, Lestrade. We will come at once." I stared at him. "At once?" "Time," said Holmes, already reaching for his coat, "is the one thing we cannot afford to waste when a man arranges his effects so carefully." Lestrade looked relieved. "I've got a cab waiting." "Then we shall not keep it waiting," said Holmes. We were soon descending into the foggy street, the gas lamps casting halos of yellow light through the murk. As we drove, Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed once more. I knew better than to disturb him, yet the events of the evening pressed too heavily upon me for silence. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you believe this affair is connected with what happened here?" He opened one eye. "My dear Watson," said he, "I should be gravely disappointed if it were not." The Bloomsbury house stood dark and austere behind its iron railings, its windows like blank eyes staring into the square. A constable admitted us, and we ascended the narrow staircase to the study. Even before Holmes crossed the threshold, I saw his whole bearing change. He became alert, predatory, like a man entering contested ground. The study was a long, narrow room, lined with books and lit by a single lamp upon the desk. Mr. Calderwick sat as he had died, his head slightly bowed, his hands resting upon the blotter. His face was calm, too calm, I thought, for a man who had met sudden death. Holmes stood very still, taking in the room with a single, sweeping glance. "No disturbance," he murmured. "No violence. A man at ease." He stepped forward and examined the body with care, his fingers light and precise. "No sign of poison upon the lips," said he. "No injection marks, no bruising. The heart— Watson, what do you make of the expression?" I studied the dead man's face. "He looks attentive," I said slowly, "as if he were listening." Holmes shot me a quick look of approval. "Exactly." He moved to the door and examined the bolt, then to the windows, then finally to the floor. He knelt, or as he had done in our passage, and peered closely at the boards near the skirting. "There," said he. I bent beside him. At first I saw nothing, then I perceived it, a faint scuff, barely visible, as though something soft had brushed the dust aside. "Another footprint?" I asked. "No," said Holmes, "the absence of one." He straightened and paced the length of the room. "A man alone," he said, "in a locked room. He speaks, or begins to. Something answers him, keeping pace with his movements. He listens, he does not flee, he does not cry out, he dies." Lestrade frowned. "You make it sound as if he were frightened to death." Holmes smiled thinly. "Fear," said he, "is only one way to stop a heart." He returned to the desk and examined the papers upon it. Most were mundane, accounts, correspondence, drafts of letters. One, however, and he lifted with particular care. "This," said Holmes, "is interesting." He handed it to Lestrade. It was a single sheet, covered in cramped handwriting. Lestrade read aloud, "I will not be drawn into this again. The past is done. If you persist, you will leave me no choice but silence." He looked up. "No signature, no address." Holmes nodded. "Written this morning," said he. "See how the ink has feathered. The pen was pressed too hard. A man under strain." "To whom?" I asked. "To someone who had already spoken to him," said Holmes. "Someone who did not use words." He turned suddenly and addressed the empty room. "You see, Watson, Calderwick was not surprised. He was prepared. He knew the voice, if voice it was." He sat and listened, and when it answered him in the only language it possessed, his body betrayed him. Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You're talking in riddles, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes were fixed upon the far wall, where the lamplight cast his own elongated shadow. "Not riddles," said he quietly. "Reflections." He stepped closer to the wall and moved his hand. The shadow moved with it. "Perfect mimicry," he murmured. "Unthinking, automatic." He stamped his foot once upon the floor. The sound echoed hollowly through the house, and from somewhere deep within the structure came a second sound, softer, delayed by the barest fraction of a second. Tap. Lestrade stiffened. "What was that?" Holmes's lips curved into a grim smile. "That," said he, "was not an echo." The sound came again. Tap. Holmes turned to us, his eyes bright with a fierce, controlled excitement. "Our correspondent has followed us," said he. He has ensured that we cannot follow him." "And what do we do now?" I asked. Holmes reached into his pocket and drew out the folded slip of paper from Baker Street. "We answer," said he simply. Holmes wasted no time in explaining himself. He crossed the study in 3 swift strides, opened the door, and listened intently, his head inclined. The house lay hushed, save for the distant murmur of the square beyond the windows and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere below. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds there lingered something else, attention, as though the walls themselves were attentive. "Lestrade," said Holmes quietly, "have the house cleared. No constables on the stair, no servants loitering. If our visitor wishes to converse, we must not frighten him into silence." Lestrade stared. "I tell me, you think someone's still here?" "I think," replied Holmes, "that someone never left." Reluctantly, the inspector issued his orders. We waited until the sounds of retreating footsteps faded, and the house was left to us. Holmes closed the study door once more and bolted it, testing the mechanism with care. "Locked rooms," he murmured, "they encourage honesty." He turned down the lamp until the study lay half in shadow. The long bookcases loomed like dark sentinels. Holmes placed himself deliberately in the centre of the room and stood motionless. "Now, Watson," said he, without turning his head, "observe." He took a single step to the left. From somewhere beyond the wall or beneath the floor came a corresponding sound, a soft scrape, a step, measured and exact. Lestrade swore under his breath. Holmes stepped back. The sound retreated. "Wait there," said Holmes calmly. "Call and response. No words, only movement." "And how is it done?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes raised a finger. "Patience." He bent and rapped his knuckles sharply upon the floorboards. The sound was answered, not from below this time, but from the wall to our right. A dull knock, as if someone had struck wood from the other side. Holmes smiled faintly. "Excellent manners," said he. "Now we are getting somewhere." He moved to the wall and ran his fingers along the panelling. It was old work, dark with age, but one panel gave beneath his touch with the slightest yielding pressure. Holmes straightened at once. "Lestrade," said he, "this house has a history. Do you know it?" The inspector shook his head. "It was built in the last century," Holmes continued. "And like many such houses, it has been altered, extended."
"I subdivided. Builders are careless men. They leave behind them spaces, voids, where no one thinks to look." He pressed upon the panel again, harder this time. There was a faint click. The answering sound came instantly, closer now, almost eager. Tap. Holmes stepped back, his eyes gleaming. "You see, our friend is impatient." "With what?" I asked. "With being noticed," said Holmes. He took from his pocket the scrap of paper we had found upon Calderwick's desk and held it up. "Silence," he read aloud. A curious choice of words, not "I will not answer," but his silence, as though sound itself were the danger. He turned sharply and addressed the wall. "You wished me to ask you back," said he, his voice clear and firm. "Very well. Who are you?" There was a pause. Then came a sound I shall never forget. Not speech,
All but a careful sequence of movements. One step, a pause, another step, then 3 quick taps in succession. Holmes's eyes shone. "A code," he murmured. "Crude, but serviceable." "What does it mean?" Lestrade asked. "It means," said Holmes, "that our man cannot speak. Not here, at least, but he can answer." He knelt swiftly and produced from his pocket a piece of chalk. With deft strokes, he marked the floor. "Watson," said he, "when I stamp once, he answers once, twice, twice. It is a simple mimicry, but note the delay, a fraction of a second, that tells us the distance." He stamped once. Tap. He stamped twice. Tap, tap. "About 12 feet," said Holmes, "between us and him, and separated not by air, but by structure." He rose and struck the wall smartly with the poker. The answering knock came instantly, louder now, almost impatient. Holmes nodded, as if greeting an acquaintance. "Yes," said he, "you are there." He moved aside a bookcase with surprising ease, revealing a narrow door half concealed in the shadows. It was flush with the wall, its edges almost invisible beneath years of paint. "A servant's passage," said Holmes. "Long disused, I should think." Lestrade sprang forward. "Then the man's behind it." "Was," said Holmes, "or still is, but not for long." Holmes did not open the door at once. Instead, he turned back to the body of Calderwick. "You see, Watson," said he softly, "Calderwick was not murdered in the usual sense. He was compelled." "Compelled to die?" I asked. "To listen," said Holmes. He gestured toward the hidden door. "A man who knows that his past is hunting him, a man who hears its footsteps answering his own, each movement mirrored, each pause respected. The effect is subtle, but devastating." "And the second crime?" Lestrade asked. Holmes looked at him keenly. "Second? You said earlier, rising stakes." Holmes smiled thinly. "Quite so." He went at last to the concealed door and flung it open. Beyond lay a narrow passage, scarcely wide enough for a man to pass. It ran parallel to the study wall, dark and close, its air stale. At the far end stood a figure. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the shadows. He did not move, he merely stood, watching us. For an instant none of us spoke. Then Holmes stepped forward. "Good evening," said he pleasantly. "You have been very obliging." The man did not answer. Instead, he took a single step forward. Holmes matched it. The man halted. Holmes halted. Lestrade drew a sharp breath. Good Lord." Holmes did not take his eyes from the figure. "You see now," said he quietly. "Perfect discipline, perfect restraint." He took a step back. The man stepped back. Holmes smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "You frightened Calderwick because he recognized you," said Holmes. "You frightened him because you had frightened him before, years ago, in another house, another passage." The man's head tilted slightly. "Yes," said Holmes softly. "You remember?" He stamped once upon the floor. The man answered with a stamp, but this time the delay was longer. Holmes's smile faded. "Ah," said he, "fatigue." In a flash, Holmes lunged forward, seized the man by the collar, and dragged him into the light. The illusion shattered at once. The careful mimicry dissolved into clumsy resistance as Lestrade rushed forward to clap irons upon him. But the man struggled, but without much force. His face, now visible, was pale and drawn, his eyes fever-bright. "It wasn't murder," he gasped. "I never touched him." "No," said Holmes coldly. "You only made him listen." As Lestrade led the man away, Holmes turned back to me, his expression grave. "The case is not finished," said he. "We have answered him, but now we must learn why he spoke in shadows." I looked once more at Calderwick's still form, at the empty study, at the hidden passage that had carried terror on silent feet. "And will he tell us?" I asked. Holmes's eyes followed the retreating figure into the darkness. "Oh, yes," said he. "He has already begun." Lestrade conducted the prisoner down the narrow stair with more care than ceremony, for the man's strength seemed to have deserted him entirely now that his artifice was stripped away. I followed, while Holmes lingered a moment longer in the study, standing before the concealed passage with an expression of thoughtful distaste, as though the place itself offended his sense of order. When at last he joined us, the house had taken on that peculiar air of relief which follows the removal of a long-suffered presence. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something essential still eluded us. The prisoner was seated in the dining room below, his wrists cuffed, his shoulders bowed forward. In the brighter light, his appearance was more pitiful than menacing. He was not young, yet neither was he old, one of those men whose years seem worn thin by anxiety rather than age. His boots, I noted, were soft-soled and carefully mended, their edges rounded smooth by deliberate wear. Holmes observed this too. His eyes flicked down and then back up again, and I knew the observation had found its proper place. "What is your name?" Lestrade demanded. The man hesitated, then spoke at last, his voice hoarse, as though unused. "Silas Mornay?" Holmes's head lifted slightly. "Mornay," he repeated. "Yes, that fits." Lestrade glanced at him sharply. "You know him?" "Not personally," said Holmes. "But I know the type of man who chooses such a passage for his work." Mornay's lips twitched faintly. "Work," he echoed. "That's what you call it?" "It is what you made of it," said Holmes. "You cultivated silence, as another man might cultivate roses. You learned the language of floors and walls. You made yourself a shadow." Mornay looked up at him then, and for the first time there was something like defiance in his eyes. "He deserved it," said he. "If you had heard what I heard—" Holmes cut him short with a raised hand. "We will come to that. First, you will tell us how you came to Bloomsbury Square." Mornay laughed bitterly. "Through the wall," said he. "The same way I always do." Holmes nodded. "You have been using old service passages for years," he said, "in lodging houses, in town houses, any place where careless renovation has left behind a vein of darkness. You listen, you wait, you answer." "You make it sound clever," Mornay said. "It is clever," replied Holmes coolly, "and therefore dangerous." Lestrade leaned forward. "You followed Colderwick, then?" Mornay's gaze dropped to the table. "He moved," he said. "He thought he was safe, but I knew his habits. And he always chose houses with something hidden. He liked secrets." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Because he had lived with one." Mornay's breath caught. "Tell us," said Holmes quietly, "about the first house." There was a long silence. At last, Mornay spoke. "It was in Kent," said he. "Years ago. I was a caretaker. The house had a passage behind the walls, used once, long before my time. Colderwick discovered it. He thought it amusing. He liked to frighten people." "To frighten them how?" I asked. Mornay's hands clenched. "By answering them," he said. "By walking when they walked, by stopping when they stopped, by letting them feel that something watched them from the dark." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you learned from him?" "I had no choice," Mornay snapped. "I heard him do it night after night. I heard the tenants panic. One woman left screaming, another refused to sleep indoors, and Colderwick—" He laughed. "Until," said Holmes, "you answered him." Mornay swallowed. "One night," he said, "I followed him into the passage. He didn't know at first. I mirrored him, just as he'd done to others. When he realized—" His voice faltered. "He begged me to stop." "And did you?" asked Holmes. Mornay shook his head. "No." Holmes's face was unreadable. "Yet he lived." "He paid me," said Mornay bitterly, "to leave, to be silent." "Silence again," Holmes murmured. "Yes," said Mornay. "He thought money could bury anything, but it didn't bury the sound. I could still hear him, in my head." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "So you followed him to London?" "I waited," said Mornay. "Years. Until I heard he'd taken another house, another hidden place, and I wanted him to hear what others had heard." "And you succeeded," said Holmes. Mornay's shoulders sagged. "I didn't mean for him to die." "No," said Holmes. "You meant for him to listen." He turned away, pacing slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Fear alone rarely kills," he said. "But sustained anticipation, expectation can. Colderwick recognized your method. He knew what was coming, and that knowledge broke him." Lestrade exhaled. "Manslaughter, then?" Holmes stopped. "No," said he. "Murder." Mornay looked up sharply. "You said—" "I said you did not touch him," Holmes replied. "I did not say you did not kill him. You constructed the conditions of his death with care and intent." Mornay's face collapsed into despair. As Lestrade led him away, Holmes remained standing, lost in thought. I approached him quietly. You seem troubled," I said. Holmes nodded. "Because this is not the end," said he. "Not the end?" Mornay was not improvising, Holmes continued. He refined a technique. He learned it somewhere. "From Colderwick?" "Yes, but Colderwick learned it too," said Holmes. "And men rarely invent cruelty from nothing." We returned at last to Baker Street in the small hours of the morning. The fog had thinned, but the street still lay quiet, as if holding its breath. Holmes paused upon the step before unlocking the door. "Watson," said he, "do you recall the message?" "Ask me back," I said. He nodded. "Mornay answered Colderwick. but someone answered Mornay first. Inside, the rooms were exactly as we had left them, yet the familiarity felt altered, as though the silence itself had acquired a shape. Holmes crossed to the hearth and knelt, or examining the skirting with care. After a moment he rose, holding something between finger and thumb, another pellet of black wax. His eyes met mine, and for the first time that night I saw a flicker of unease pass across his face. "Our correspondent," said Holmes softly, "has very good timing." He held the pellet to the light. It bore no writing, only a shallow mark as if pressed by a boot heel. The shadow, it seemed, had not finished answering back. Holmes did not speak at once. He stood very still by the hearth, the black pellet resting upon his palm, as though weighing not its substance but its implication. I had seen him confront murderers, madmen, and kings without a tremor. Yet there was something in this small, mute object that struck deeper. It was not a threat. It was a reminder. "At what hour did we leave the house?" he asked suddenly. "A little past 1, I replied. "And returned?" "Near 3. Holmes nodded. "Then our visitor has been here within the last quarter hour." I glanced instinctively toward the door, half expecting to see the handle turn of its own accord. "There are no fresh sounds," I said. "Precisely," Holmes returned. "He has learned restraint." He crossed the room and placed the pellet upon the table beside its twin from the earlier message. They were identical in size and sheen. "Watson," said he, "note the difference." I leaned closer. "There is no paper within this one." "Just so," said Holmes. "No words, only a mark." He held it up to the lamp. The shallow indentation was unmistakable, the curved edge of a boot heel pressed with deliberation. "A signature," I ventured.
An acknowledgement," Holmes corrected. "He knows we have heard." "And who is he?" I asked. Holmes seated himself at last, his long fingers steepled. "Someone who did not frighten Colderwick directly," said he. "Someone who taught Colderwick the language of shadows. Someone who, having been answered once, expects to be answered again." He rose abruptly and went to the window, parting the curtain. "Observe," said he. The fog had thinned further, leaving Baker Street clear and pale beneath the lamps. A single figure passed on the far pavement, walking with an unremarkable gait. "Anyone might walk thus," I said. "Anyone," Holmes agreed. "That is the danger." He let the curtain fall and turned back to me. "Mornay was a student," he said. "Colderwick, an enthusiast. But the first hand that shaped this method was colder."
More patient. "You think there are others?" I asked. "I know there have been," said Holmes. "The records are scattered, reports of nervous collapse, unexplained terror, houses abandoned without reason, always dismissed, always attributed to the imagination." "And now?" I said. "Now," Holmes replied quietly, "someone has noticed me noticing." There came a soft knock at the door, Mrs. Hudson, bringing tea and wearing an expression of mild concern. "Everything all right, Mr. Holmes?" she asked. "I thought I heard you come in late." "All quite well, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said gently. "You may retire." She lingered a moment. "There was a gentleman earlier," she said. "Asked for you." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Earlier?" "Just before midnight," she replied. "Tall gentleman, quiet voice. He said he would return." "Did he give a name?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, sir. Only asked if you were fond of puzzles." Holmes smiled thinly. "I am." Mrs. Hudson withdrew, and Holmes remained standing, lost in thought. "He did not enter," he murmured. "He did not need to." He took his violin from its case and began to play, softly at first, then with increasing complexity. The notes wound through the room, probing, questioning. I had learned that Holmes played thus not for pleasure, but for clarity, each phrase a thought-given sound. Halfway through a long, sustained passage, he stopped. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I listened. At first there was nothing, then, faint, almost imperceptible, a sound from beyond the wall, a footfall. Holmes smiled grimly. "Excellent," said he. "He cannot help himself." He stamped once. Nothing. He stamped twice. Nothing. Holmes's expression hardened. "Está," said he. "You are learning too." He turned to me. "Watson, our correspondent, has ceased to mimic. He now observes." "What do you intend to do?" I asked. "Invite him properly," Holmes replied. He took up a sheet of paper and wrote swiftly. When he finished, he folded it and wrapped it in black wax, moulding the pellet with care. "What does it say?" I asked. He handed it to me. I read, "The answer is listening." Holmes nodded. "Place it beneath the door." I did so, my heart beating rather faster than I cared to admit. When I returned, Holmes was already extinguishing the lamps. "We will sit in the dark," said he. "He prefers it so." The minutes stretched. The house creaked softly, settling into its old age. My senses sharpened until every sound seemed charged with meaning. Then, softly, unmistakably, came a movement upon the landing. A pause, another movement. Not a mimicry this time, but a measured approach. Holmes did not move. He merely spoke. "You are early," he said. There was a silence so complete it seemed to press upon the ears. Then from just beyond the door came a single sound, the slow, deliberate scrape of a boot heel against wood. Holmes exhaled softly. "Yes," he murmured. "I thought so." He rose and flung open the door. The passage was empty, yet upon the floor lay the wax pellet I had placed there, now crushed beneath a heel, its shape distorted, its message destroyed. Holmes bent and examined it. "He refuses words," he said. "Very well." He straightened and looked at me with sudden intensity. "Watson," said he, "do you recall the Bloomsbury house?" "The passage?" I asked. "The tree," said Holmes, "the plane tree outside the study window. It was mentioned for a reason." I frowned. "Because it casts a shadow?" "Yes," said Holmes, "and because it answers." He took up his coat. "Come. The night is not yet finished." As we stepped once more into Baker Street, I felt the peculiar certainty that we were no longer pursuing a criminal in the ordinary sense, but engaging in a contest of perception, one in which sound, movement, and patience were weapons as sharp as any blade. Behind us, in the darkened rooms of Baker Street, the silence waited. And somewhere in London, a shadow listened. The square lay quiet beneath the paling sky when we reached Bloomsbury once more, the fog reduced now to a thin, reluctant veil that clung to the iron railings and the bare branches of the plane tree. Holmes halted before it at once, and regarding it with the fixed attention one might give a suspect who has not yet learned he is suspected. "There," said Holmes softly, "the oldest listener in the square." I followed his gaze. The tree's trunk was thick and fissured, its roots thrusting up the pavement stones in stubborn protest against time and order. One great limb stretched toward the upper windows of Calderwick's former study, casting a long, crooked shadow across the brickwork. "You said it answered," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "Not of itself. Nothing answers without a reason." He knelt and examined the base of the trunk, brushing aside damp leaves and soil with his gloved hand. A moment later he gave a low sound of satisfaction. "As I thought," said he. "Iron grating, modern, installed to protect the roots." "And beneath it?" I asked. Holmes tapped the metal lightly. Its sound rang hollow. "An access shaft," he said. one of several installed during the sewer works of 72. Most were sealed. Some were forgotten. He rose and stepped back, studying the angle of the branches, the proximity of the wall, the line of shadow cast even in the weak morning light. A man walking here, he continued, would cast his silhouette directly into the study at night. A man walking here would be heard, if he wished to be heard, through the roots, through the shaft, through the thin bones of an old house. "You mean," I began. "I mean," Holmes interrupted gently, "that the answering shadow was never behind the wall at all. It was beneath the ground." We circled the tree, and there Holmes found what he sought. A narrow iron plate, its screws newly turned. He pried it open with his knife. Below yawned a blackness that smelled of damp earth and rusted metal. "Sound travels well here," said Holmes. "A footstep above becomes a whisper below. A whisper below becomes a knock above. With patience, with practice, one may learn to place his sounds precisely." "And the delay?" I asked. "The fraction of a second?" Holmes smiled. "Distance and depth. Enough to convince the ear that the answer comes from elsewhere. Enough to unsettle." We descended carefully, Holmes first, into the narrow maintenance tunnel beneath the square. It ran parallel to the houses, low and cramped, its walls slick with moisture. Here and there, thin pipes and abandoned cables clung like veins. Holmes stopped and pointed upward. "Directly beneath the study," said he, "and beneath Baker Street, too, by a similar arrangement. Our correspondent chose his houses well." We advanced a little farther until Holmes raised a hand for silence. Ahead, a dim lantern glow flickered against the curve of the tunnel. A man stood there, his back to us, listening. He did not turn when Holmes spoke. "You have a remarkable ear," said Holmes calmly. "But you rely too much upon it?" The man stiffened. "You taught Calderwick," Holmes went on. "You frightened him long before Mornay ever learned the trick. You used houses as instruments and men as strings." The man turned slowly. He was older than I had expected, his hair grey, his face composed to the point of severity. He regarded Holmes with an expression of cool appraisal. "You are Holmes," said he. "I hoped you would come." "I do not doubt it," Holmes replied.
Your messages were invitations." The man inclined his head slightly. "I wished to see if the great detective would listen as others had listened." "And now?" asked Holmes. "Now," said the man, "I see that you have." Holmes's eyes were steady. "Your name?" "Julian Ashcombe," he said, "architect." Holmes nodded. "Of course. You designed renovations. You learned the bones of houses. You learned where sound hides." Ashcombe smiled faintly. "I learned that people are most honest when they think they are alone." "You used that knowledge to terrorize them," said Holmes, "to control them." "To reveal them," Ashcombe corrected. "Fear strips away pretense." Holmes shook his head. "Fear destroys proportion. Calderwick delighted in your lessons until he became their subject. Mornay learned them as a victim learns a weapon. And you—" Holmes stepped closer. "You stepped away, leaving echoes behind you." Ashcombe's composure cracked at last. "They chose to listen," he said sharply. "And you chose to speak," Holmes replied. "Without words, without mercy." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the tunnel. "You answered my invitation," Ashcombe said. "Does that not make you like them?" Holmes smiled then, not his cold smile, but the thin human one I knew well. "No," said he, "because I know when to stop listening." He stepped aside, and from the darkness behind us emerged Lestrade and two constables, their lanterns casting sudden, honest light. Ashcombe closed his eyes. Later, as the square stirred to life and the sun at last burned through the last tatters of fog, Holmes and I stood once more before the plane tree.
Workmen were already at hand, sealing the shaft, hammering iron back into place. "It seems almost simple now," I said. "It always does," Holmes replied. "Afterwards?" "And the shadows?" I asked. Holmes looked up at the branches, now innocent in daylight. "Shadows are obedient things," said he. "They only move when something else moves first." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes resumed his seat by the fire, his long frame relaxing at last. "You see, Watson," said he, "there are crimes of hand and crimes of mind. The latter are quieter, but no less deadly." "And will there be others?" I asked. Holmes considered. "London is full of listening places," he said, "but fewer men now know how to make them speak." He reached for his violin, then paused. "Besides," he added, I find that I prefer my shadows silent." He drew the bow across the strings and the music rose, clear, controlled, and resolutely alive, while outside Baker Street went on about its business, unaware of how closely it had been overheard.